I'm Alan Thomas, editorial director at the University of Chicago Press. And I have the good luck to be Julia Stern's editor for Bette Davis Black and White, as well as her two previous books. This one is very special to me because it's, well, for many reasons, but one of them is that it's a significant addition to Chicago's list in experimental, autobiographically inflected criticism. That list reaches back to now classic books of the 80s and 90s, like Alice Kaplan's French Lessons, and forward to other books, including Emily Ogden's soon-to-be published On Not Knowing. Bette Davis Black and White is a star study with flashings of memoir, a history of race relations that also reckons with Julia's own coming to racial consciousness during what she calls her contraband years, holed up in her parents' basement, an awkward teen with Bette Davis as her idol. I can't wait to hear today's conversation about this amazing book. In a minute, I'll turn things over to Jim Hodge to properly introduce Julia Stern and our other guests. As a reminder, before we get started, please keep your sound muted throughout the event so that we can reduce any background noise. We'll have time for a question and answer period at the end, so please feel free to place your questions in the Zoom chat. And as a final reminder, Bette Davis Black and White is available for purchase through the Seminary Co-op bookstore. You can find a link in the chat as well. Show our independent bookstore in Hyde Park some love by ordering the book from them. It might cost a few bucks more than on Amazon, but you'll be doing it to support a great institution. So now I'm going to turn things over to Jim. James Hodge is Associate Professor of English and the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities at Northwestern University. He's the author of Sensations of History, Animation, and New Media Art. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, we're going to get right to it. So these introductions will be short and sweet, but just a quick welcome to all, to friends and admirers of Julia. I'm going to lead off with Julia, and then I'm going to introduce the three scholars who will be giving short remarks in response to Julia's book. Julia Stern is Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence, Professor of English, and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the English Department at Northwestern University. She's the author of The Plight of Feeling, Sympathy and Dissent in the Early American Novel, which was a finalist for the MLA's First Book Prize, Mary Chestnut's Civil War epic, and of course, Bette Davis Black and White, the book that we're here today to celebrate and to discuss. All these books were published by the University of Chicago Press. Her longstanding interest in the Gothic, the sentimental, and the melodramatic has found a second life in classic Hollywood cinema, aided and abetted by joyful conversations with Nick, with Miriam, Jocelyn, and myself. Welcome, Julia. Okay, quickly I'll run down the next three scholars. Miriam J. Petty is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the Graduate School at Northwestern University and Associate Professor in the Department of Radio, Television, Film. Her first book, Stealing the Show, African-American Performers and Audiences in 1930s Hollywood, seeks a historical recalibration of early Hollywood film stardom, meditating on a quintet of Black movie stars caught between fleeting mainstream fame and the complex viewing practices of Black audiences. Her current book project examines contemporary media mogul Tyler Perry's stardom, his stage and screen productions, and his appeal for contemporary African-American audiences. She thinks Bette and Medea would have been dangerously good friends. Love that detail. Okay, next up is Jocelyn Sapaniak-Gillies. Jocelyn is Director of the Film Studies Program and Associate Professor of English and Film Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is the author of The Optical Vacuum, Spectatorship and Modernized American Theater Architecture, and she is also the co-editor of Ends of Cinema. Her new manuscript in progress is a history of mind-altering substances, spectatorship, and movie exhibition. She's taught the indomitable Bette Davis in courses on classic Hollywood cinema and medicine and cinema. And last but not least is Nick Davis. Nick is an associate professor of English and gender and sexuality studies at Northwestern with a courtesy appointment in radio, TV, film. His work consistently foregrounds gender, feminism, sexuality, and LGBTQ studies in relation to commercial cinema within and beyond the US, especially over the last 3 decades. He is the author of The Desiring Image, Gilles Deleuze, and Contemporary Queer Cinema. He is currently teaching a course on female performance in modern Hollywood for the NU alumni, which sounds a bit too late, which starts a bit too late historically to take up Bette Davis, to whom he is regrettably not related. He also works off campus as a film critic, festival journalist, and freelance Oscar obsessive, which is how he first encountered Bette. All right, welcome to you, Nick. All right, so we'll have our 3 supplementary speakers go first, and each will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes with responses and conversation with myself and of course with Julia Stern. And then we will open it up to the larger audience for questions and for Q&A. And if you would like, you can also type your questions into the chat, and I will be monitoring that as well. If you would like me to ask your question for you in the larger Q&A, so that will be available. All right, but first up, I believe is Miriam. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Jim, for that introduction and for gathering us all here to celebrate such a kind and thoughtful and driven and methodical scholar as Julia Stern, who I'm happy to call a friend and neighbor, by the way. And to say that talking about this book for me is so much fun because of the way that Julia is simultaneously mobilizing theories of stardom while at the same time starring in them herself. To my mind, this is one of the most creative and provocative ways of thinking of someone like Bette Davis, who inevitably invites our identification and our admiration, but at the same time doing so in ways that aren't just about kind of self-reflecting on the sort of best things about Bette Davis, but also meditating on the things about her that are deeply complex, that are thorny, that don't always cast her in the best light, and that at times make us profoundly uncomfortable about what Bette was doing with race and what race was doing with Bette. I think for both of us, James Baldwin as the point or as a key point of departure for understanding the kinds of difficult things that race and stardom do in conversation with one another in American culture when we acknowledge that they are there, is one of the things that got Julia and I talking about this these many years ago, as I was working on Stealing the Show, and as she was working on Bette Davis, Black and White. Baldwin's mobilization of Davis's stardom is prototypical of some of the finest star theory, and certainly some of the finest Black film theory that sort of makes a space to understand that stars are not scientific. Their light doesn't shine in a way that can be measured in the same way by everyone. And so what Julia gives us in her meditation on Bette Davis then is the particular refraction of Davis's light out to Wilmette, Illinois. I love that your sound is on, Julia. And that when Richard Dyer talks about the star as a structured polysemy, right? I've described this as a kind of cut gem that as you turn it, it reflects its different facets, different sizes of those facets. They pick up the light in different ways, different colors. And so anyone's description and cathexis with an individual star is going to be different depending on who it is. This is what Julia gives us in this text, but she also gives us this wonderful window into what Black folk were doing with Bette Davis at the time. And then in this discussion of the racial afterlife of Bette Davis, what Black folks continued to do with her and make of her in the years after her heyday, and then in the years after her death. I particularly appreciated the conversation of Lynn Nodge's By the Way, Vera Stark, in which Bette Davis could be Black, right? Could have been a Black woman. This is no surprise to Black people, right? But it can be a surprise to white readers and viewers. It's certainly intended as a plot twist ending at the end of By the Way, Vera Stark, to know that this woman who we've understood throughout the play as white is in fact passing, right? The way that Baldwin writes about Bette Davis and other white stars that he engages in The Devil Finds Work is exactly in that way, to sort of frame them as people that he has grabbed and noted as not quite right, maybe not quite white. There's a way that his discussion of Davis's ugliness, we can on the one hand read as a read, we can on the one hand read as sort of picking up on the ugly duckling themes that Julia so carefully frames for us in this text, but we can also read it as the way that he understands himself ugly, stranger, not quite right, queer, on the margin, not fitting into the space in a particularly appropriate or common or straightforward way. And so his naming of Davis as ugly, ugly like me, is less about a kind of absolute read and more about his own capacity, his growing capacity to claim himself, to claim his own strength, to claim his own ugliness as less infirmity and more superpower. If Bette Davis can mobilize it as a superpower, why not me? Why not I? And so the way that this text moves in and out of a kind of dance with practices of star reception, understanding the kinds of identification that are going on across race, and the way that these acts of recognition that happen in spite of race, because of race, through race, and that Bette Davis, to be fair to both her and the Black folks who consumed her in the 30s, is clearing kind of a low bar. There's a way that for African Americans at that time to simply say, from the perspective of a white star, you have a right to exist in this space. You have a right to claim it. I'm going to do some symbolic things like, desegregate a canteen to say that that should happen. This is a moment where those kinds of incremental moves were more than nearly anyone was doing. And so she clears that low bar from the perspective of the sort of extra cinematic text. But in terms of the cinematic text, she occupies a space that is so deeply complex because of her vexed relationship to femininity and because of the way that her texts dealing with race, like so many texts in the 30s, are painfully honest about how discomfited, uncertain, and sort of fleeting relations across the color line are in that moment. So for me, there's so much joy in reading a text like this because it allows for such a productive, messy, thoughtful, and really engaging conversation about the ways that stars work with what we bring to them. So I want to say thank you, Julia, for giving us such a text as this. And I just look forward to being in conversation with you and with our colleagues. It's clearly a testament to you that the second comment in the chat is screams, which makes me very, very happy. It's also a testament to you that so many people have their cameras on in this particular Zoom. So hats off. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Miriam. Up next is Jocelyn and then Nick.
Thank you so much. It's really hard for me to express what an absolute honor and joy it is to be here with brilliant scholars and friends, Miriam, Nick, new friend Jim, and of course, the absolutely incredible Julia Stern. This is, I'll start crying if I talk too much about it. So I'm just going to jump into my remarks instead of crying in front of 130 people, okay? When I think about Julia Stern and her beloved Bette Davis, I think about how lives are lived between cameras and screens, how the things we watch when we're young inflect us maybe as much as our families do, how those people we meet yet don't know are there for us to excavate later in life, but hopefully not just in therapy. Hopefully they tell us about how ideas shape our trajectories. But after reading her book, I'm thinking about the geographies of Julia meeting Bette. And so one of the things I thought about is what it means to watch in a certain place at a certain time. What aspects of how and where we view lead to certain kinds of responses, shreds of memory, spectatorship as inquiry. Since I first met Julia more than a decade ago, she's talked about her love affair with Bette Davis. I remember being surprised to learn that this intimidating scholar of 19th century American lit was really into classical Hollywood, like a lot. When I read the Whatever Happened to Baby Jane chapter, I felt a frisson of recognition. Oh, right, there's that Hegelian dialectic she mentioned when I was a graduate student and I had no clue what she was talking about, but I think I get it now. But I have to confess something. All the times I heard her speak rapturously about afternoons spent in the presence of those eyes, that face, my imagination took me to what I now know was a fantasy. I thought of young Julia wasting her days in a repertory movie theater. That's where we see things, right? That's what we're all mourning in the COVID era, that place of encounter with the luminous, numinous screen. Turns out I'd made that up. Julia saw these movies on television. As she tells us on pages 27 and 28, my viewing was dictated by the tastes of the programmers on The Late Show at Chicago's PBS station, WTTW Channel 11, WGN Channel 9, well before its Superstation days, and VHF station Channel 32. Instead of the public intimacy of the theater, Davis infiltrated Stern's life in the most personal of places, the interior of her childhood homes. The liberating filmic intimacy I assumed Julia had with Bette was described by Roland Barthes in 1984's Leaving the Movie Theater. And I quote Barthes here, "It is in this urban dark that the body's freedom is generated. This invisible work of possible affects emerges from a veritable cinematographic cocoon. The audience there is anonymous, populated, numerous. But television," Barthes said, "doomed us to the family, a center of domesticity like the hearth, the kettle. We find ourselves bereft of a cinephilic erotics and a community when we no longer depart the theater." Of course, cinephilia is far from the only thing at stake in considering where and when something is viewed. As Julia explains in the book, Perry's played by Ernest Anderson, impassioned speech toward the end of In This Our Life was cut in screenings in the South and Harlem. Depending on where you viewed the movie, its crux was either there or not. Remarkable then that James Baldwin saw the film in Times Square, unedited. If he'd attended a screening just dozens of blocks uptown, an upended experience. And so we learn again how cinematic space is deeply, fervently political. It's a lesson in how integral not just the local, hyper-local geographies of spectatorship can be. In 2014's The New Cinephilia, Girish Shambhu makes the argument that passionate movie watching has become decentralized in the internet era. Rather than meet face-to-face or ignore each other locally in the lobby, viewers across the world have learned to converse remotely. The resulting cinephilia crosses geographies. While Julia's experience in the 70s, gorging on as much Davis as Chicago stations could dish out, was a far cry from internet communities of the 2000s, it's worth noting how both of them offer a rejoinder to Bart's dismissal of the television, and we could of course extend that today to the computer screen. Did its place in domestic interiors really doom us to the family? Or did it tell us that not everything in the home should be the family's communal property? That we can find interiority in the interior, and we can be on our own while also a part of something other than our familial strictures, whatever they're demanding that we be. By the end of Julia's book, we've entered a mise en abîme of viewing. In Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, director Robert Aldrich incites Jane's fury by showing a clip from Joan Crawford's 1930 film, Montana Moon, running on local TV. So let's imagine. A barely adolescent girl watching a Chicago affiliate sees a broadcast of a decade-old film where an older Davis is enraged by a younger Crawford's image appearing on a Southern California television. Each one is shaped by the space in which she views. Jane by the intrusion of Blanche's stardom into her cordoned-off palace, Davis playing off her rival Crawford, who performs alongside her at both a younger and an older age, Julia absorbing all of these grotesquely domestic and decidedly female perversions inside her family home. Besides delirious fun, I can't say entirely what this is, but I can say what it is not. It is not a tea kettle. It is not the hearth. It's something closer to viewing experience as thought exercise, to a multifaceted spectatorship formed inside what should be given to the family, but twists instead toward intellectual inquiry. These places of watching direct us then to the core of it, the lives between cameras and screens. A version of public intimacy returned to us, even in what purports to be, but really isn't always private. What I love about this book is how it reorients geographies I thought I knew. It's not just a history or a memoir, it's also a map. Thank you, and thank you, Julia, for this amazing book.
Do I sound okay? Is this coming through? There were some tech gaffes before. Okay. So brevity is not my gift in this life, but I'm going to try. The really short version of what I'm about to say, Julia, is I love you. I love your book. Bullet points at the outset. I love about this book that it takes us back to the most vaunted period in Bette Davis's career, but does not make the expected pit stops and does not do it in the expected order. So as Julia tells us, Davis herself would never have wanted in this our life to be one of the cities that we disembarked from the cruise liner and spent a week. But we learn so much by having Julia make sure that we do that. We learn a lot by unhabituating ourselves from thinking that Baby Jane is a generically different, belated, gruesome, historically distant outlier from her Warner Brothers career earlier. And Julia asks us to think of it as in some ways a direct continuation, but she does that from an unexpected vantage of analysis. I love that. I love that Julia's sense of an actress's work and an actress's worth are not just about the on-screen performances and not just about the biographical life, although she's meticulous about both. They're also about negotiations, whether contractual or quotidian or social. They're about happenstance, a major, sometimes unacknowledged force in all of our public and private lives. They are about professed sympathy and affiliations, often manifested through overt language or conscious action, but they're just as much, and Miriam alluded to this, about opaque or unexamined impulse, and maybe even ways in which we break from character or disappoint our own values or complicate our own professed legacies and leave it to our acquaintances and friends and neighbors and researchers to try to understand them. They're about relationships. They're not just about Bette, they're not just about Julia, they're about the whole constellation that is both of those people, many of whom are on this call. And they're about change over time for Bette Davis and for Julia. I want to lean into the change over time. I want to say I am so gratified and happy almost any time to read a sustained book length, optometrist adjusted 2020 assessment of the writer's subjective and affective attachment, not just to a topic of study, but especially if it's to an idol or a hero, and to really scrutinize what that means about the hero, but also about the writer. I'm equally happy to read a book that is so vigorously and empirically researched at far-flung archives and with a wide, purposely expansive range of interlocutors, that there are 70 pages of footnotes at the end of this book, and that they are just as juicy reading as the body of the work, and in fact are part of the body of the work. I would like us all for a second just to contemplate the genuine rarity of a book that is both of those things. Imagine a completely concerted and reflective inward journey into our own emotional life, and how and where it originated and developed, that comes part and parcel with an expansive dialogue with the historical record, but also with many, many other people's perspectives. And I want to close by thinking particularly how that manifests around the category of whiteness, as something that this book never offers as a neutral or default or uninterrogated category. It never pretends it to be the assumed baseline of a study of classic Hollywood. Miriam's scholarship insists that we don't see it that way. A lot of people's scholarship on this call insists we don't see it that way, but it's not acknowledged that way often enough. And Julia makes sure that a white writer writing about a right star does not assume that either. I think it's a major success and point of the book that it does not approach Davis's monolith or Davis's whiteness as only a monolith. There are certain biases and characters and effects of Bette Davis's whiteness that do feel repeated across iterations, which is something that whiteness often does. It shows up and manifests in some pretty predictable ways. And yet, the book convinces us that Bette Davis was cognizant in making sure that Regina Giddens' whiteness in The Little Foxes, whether historically, culturally, behaviorally, even cosmetically, is not the same thing as Julie Marsden's whiteness in Jezebel, which are not the same as Stanley's and In This Our Life, which are not the same as Baby Jane's or Margot Channing's or even Davis's own. I'm equally moved that Julia approaches her own whiteness as what Miriam has already called the kind of cut gem, that she's willing to approach kaleidoscopically, articulating all kinds of enthusiasms and hooks of interest and biases and omissions that may well be symptomatic and characteristic of many of us who identify as white film cinephiles or who just identify as white people. There are a lot of persistent patterns, and Julia is willing to voice them. But Julia is scrupulous about thinking about her whiteness in conjunction always with her Jewishness, with her youth, with her intellectualism and her gender. And because that intellectualism manifests already in this young teenage viewer who is a teenage girl, it gets mistaken for excess or for emotional amplitude. And in all of those ways that adjust from moment to moment, from case to case, but also over time, Julia gives us such a thorough accounting of both broad stroke and specific whiteness in affect, in reception, and in performance. And I just want to really insist on what I take as the bravery and the vulnerability of that, especially on these topics and at this time. Rightly, all of us, hopefully all of us, and I speak here particularly as a white person, are being charged to be more self-reflective and more self-scrutinizing of our own assumptions, our own executions of what we imagine to be our place in the world or our values. And sometimes we do that really valuably by taking on languages that are rarely the ones that might have been self-conscious or organic to the ways we acculturated as white or acculturated into our other identities. So privilege or fragility or diversity or inclusion can do really important work because they're likely to be not the words that were in our minds or our hearts while we came into these assumptions and identities. But they may also, in some cases, operate the way, Julia, you described Bette Davis's dresses, that they knock out their first week of filming, but after that, they need to be duplicated, or they need to be replaced with something else, or they start looking like they're in need of some mending. And what you are willing to do in this book is a kind of transparency and candor from the location of your own accumulated selves, of how it actually felt, and how it actually changed and didn't change over time, to be a witness to yourself and a witness to Bette Davis and what those two things had to do with each other. I think to offer without saying in framed language, this is a book in critical whiteness studies, I think to say over time, you can be relentless in your attention and scrupulous in your focus on something and at the same moment miss important things about it. That's an important insight for all of us as scholars and as people. It's a very important insight for those of us who are white and are working on race and working on our own whiteness. I think to be able to say that the student or the child or the teenager or the adolescent who forms certain biases or assumptions or enthusiasms or questions or confusions is hopefully a different person than the adult and the scholar who is now reassessing and thinking back while still occupying them. But you're honest enough to also say that that student, that adolescent, the person in the basement TV viewing room that Jocelyn talked about is often very much still us. And you perform on the page how you're willing to test and expand and rethink those ideas, those readings, those assumptions, and you don't just do it in the notes, you do it in the body of the text, and sometimes by naming the input of people who, again, are on this call. But I also appreciated the honesty of you being willing to draw occasionally a line and say, I hear Ed Guerrero on the page. I hear Quinn Perry in this conversation. I know they're telling me they don't see how Julie Marsden and Jezebel can possibly sit down and just discard white privilege and become the playmate and co-participant and peer of these enslaved adults and children on her plantation. But I, Julia Stern, am going to say that is the provocation of Jezebel, and it's the way I've always related to that scene. And there are other things that I have been willing to and able to rethink, and it turns out that one's inveterate. That's part of my perspective that I'm going to offer to the world as my own proposition. So that level of transparency is something I think we could all offer more of to each other, and not just in our work, but especially in an event like this in our scholarship. And Julia, to be as vigorous and solicitous of as many people's viewpoints, people you knew and people you didn't know, in a variety of walks of life and identity perspectives and fields, and genuinely incorporate so much feedback about a book that was always full of different facets and propositions, to actually do the work of sitting with and utilizing the feedback that you got. But we all know that in doing that, sometimes we lose what was personal to us about the project, or it can feel like you have to make some kind of unfair choice between a book that's personal and a book that responds to the collective. And you generated both of those things. And I find it really moving that, like Jocelyn, I feel like I might cry, but it never stopped feeling like a book by Julia about Betty, but also about Julia, like a book you wrote for yourself, where I take you as meaning every single thing you say in this book and meaning to say it in the exact way that you say it. But you invite your readers in and you start an actual conversation, which is what we're all supposed to be doing. And it frees me into feeling like I can respond to the work, your work and Bette Davis's work, in my own eccentricity and in my own specificity, and be self-scrutinizing as you model, but also generous and attentive and reflective as you model. So I just want to thank you for the book and congratulate you for being here, and bring into the space Bette, who is close to all of our hearts all the time. And you make it only more so through what you've shared with us on the page. Thanks so much, Julia.
Julia, I think that you should respond. I'm gonna, but I need to quickly say something. I said I wasn't gonna say anything, but I wanna say one note of praise, which is that this is for the wider audience, especially for the folks who are here from beyond academia, friends and family. This is a book that's really exquisitely written. It is a book that is deeply satisfying and delighting for experts and for academics, but I also imagine this is a very accessible book for non-experts as well. This is not a closed off book by any means. My own experience reading it was watching one film and then reading a chapter. So 4 of the 6 chapters are organized primarily around a single Bette Davis movie. These are The Little Foxes, Jezebel, In This Our Life, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And I can speak from personal experience that it's a very satisfying readerly experience as someone who doesn't know a ton didn't know a lot about Bette Davis, a little bit, but like not as much as Nick and Jocelyn and Miriam, to read this over the past week, watch a film, read a chapter, watch a film, read a chapter. And that sort of toggling between the two was really fun. And I just want to underline that experience and offer that note of appreciation to Julia. And sorry, Julia, you should now take your turn, please.
As I've been saying all week, I should know how to unmute a Zoom window by this point. Thank you all my beloved friends and colleagues for those amazing readings. I was taking notes. I've been trained to take notes from a very early age. Liz Coffey, you know this is true. Wealthy women take notes. I feel like I'm at my own memorial service, and I get to, revel in the joy of the beloved community of all of you coming today, those known and unknown, from so many different strata of my life, and so many of you involved in mentoring me to the writing of this book. I want to just very briefly share an anecdote that is in the book, but for most people haven't had their hands on it yet. My father, who was born in 1930, hated Bette Davis, and he was dragged to the double feature Saturday films during the Depression by his mother, who was a fiend for not old movies, for current movies. And she loved nothing more than a woman's weepy film, right? A melodrama starring Davis or Crawford or a comedy by Carol Lombard, the whole range, Barbara Stanwyck. And he found these exercises agonizing. And he would be in the movie theater with his mother, weeping, literally weeping in the movie theater, trying to get away, go to the candy counter, do anything he could to just make this time pass. And finally, when he was 10 in 1940, she allowed him to go to the movies with friends. And he got to see Captain Blood and the Seahawk and various other swashbuckling pictures, and never had to see Bette Davis again, until his oldest daughter became a fanatic at a very young age. And when the VCR was invented around 1980, 81, I don't remember, you guys will know better than I, and we finally had one. When my siblings and I would come home from college, I would insist that we rent Dark Victory, Now Voyager, The Little Foxes, Baby Jane, and Baby Jane became my idée fixe. And it got to the point where Michael and I would be coming home with our young Nicholas, and Richard would be bringing Emma and Jake with his wife Grace, and these kids were all watching these movies. And my father said to me at one point, "Why do we have to watch this film? Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? We've seen it 45 times. I don't understand why you make us watch this movie every time you come home." And I said to him, "Because it's about a family." And I just looked him in the eye, and it was just the most wonderful moment. And it was a different Bette Davis for my father from that point on. The other thing I want to say is that I've been thinking a lot about an amazing meeting I had with Miriam and Nick. Can you guys remember how many years this was ago? Was it like 2018? Miriam, your book was already out, or it was not out?
I think it was about 4 years ago, Julia.
Your book was out in 16?
Yes, yeah, I think it was out already.
I think it was in press. I don't even know that it was out, because it would have been so incredibly helpful before that. But anyway, Nick and Miriam, out of their incredible generosity and loveliness, gave me a manuscript review. And I think I was like 55 years old at the time. It was like, way above and beyond the Call of Duty. You shouldn't be 55 when you're having a manuscript review. But anyway, they sat me down. We tried to go to the Brothers K, the cafe in Evanston on Main Street, and it was too packed, and there was no COVID. So we went across the street to Starbucks, and we were in there so long that the sun started setting, and Michael strolled by the window. I don't know if you remember this. On his way home from the train, he had no idea we were going to be doing this. And I think he saw Nick actually, and he knocked on the window. It was hilarious, but that's how long we were in there. The seasons were changing. And Miriam gave me this amazing piece of advice. Actually, it was both of you. You both said, "You are idealizing this figure." And we all knew the story about the blackface masquerade that she participated in when she's 70, which is sort of a big moment in my book. She blacked up her face and wore an Afro wig and said she was in mourning for her career at the age of 70 on her birthday. And she showed that image on Johnny Carson, which had something like 30 or 40 million viewers who saw that, and nobody raised a peep. And she published it in her final autobiography. And you both said to me, you love her, you've idealized her. She is, she's a monument, right? And that's a problem. And I kind of slunk into my chair. I immediately knew you were absolutely right. And so what I want to say today is that we've got the issue of identification as a kind of a psychoanalytic concept for thinking about spectatorship and what we see and what we do when we're watching the screen. But we also have, or one also has, and I certainly have, a problem with idealization. I tend to do it right and left. And those of you who know me know this is absolutely true. It's sort of a core flaw or feature. Maybe it's not a bug, it's a feature of my wiring. And so I want to throw out there to everybody, to the panel, race and idealization, not just race and identification, but the idea, and Mitch Breitweiser's in the middle of, he was in the middle of my screen, which I thought was perfect. He's now moved over a little bit, but he has taught me about monumentalization, fetishization, idealization is an impulse that people who are bereaved, for example, use when they don't want to do the work of mourning or when they can't. And when you blow something up to be a monument or a fetish or, a photograph by George Horrell, the great Hollywood photographer, who captured the portraits of Katharine Hepburn and Davis and Crawford and so forth. How does idealization figure in to the drive for spectatorship and identification? And might that be a way to think about race on screen, which is something I hadn't figured out by the time I turned in the final manuscript, alas, but if I were still working on it, that's what I would be wanting to think about. Mary, you look like you were about to speak.
I'm always talking to myself on Zooms. And
I love it.
Like, are you muted? And I'm like, yes, I'm muted. I'm talking. So when I start arguing with myself, then we'll know, maybe time for a career change. I think you're absolutely right about the way that idealization fits into it. I love the connection to mourning, but I think that idealization works as a defense mechanism in lots of ways, right? And so I think that's part of what I think leaning into that bug or that complexity of Bette Davis's instead of insisting on the idealized version just opened up so many possibilities in this text that did not insist on seeing her as someone whose feet were either clay or bronze or gold, but rather flesh and therefore fallible and more complex. So, I think I'm so glad that you posed that, and I think we can touch back on that. I'm seeing that there may be some questions coming for us, so I'm happy to vamp, but I'm also happy to seed. And I also want to make space for the other panelists to talk about this idea, because I think it's a really fertile one. And for stars, obviously, it's fundamental to sort of having stars be something other than two-dimensional, which is the requisite for them in order to have some kind of staying power, right? So, yeah.
I'll just add, Julia, that for all that we're talking about the resisting the idealization, the book is still such a celebration of Bette Davis, and to model for all of us that with our idols, but also with ourselves, we can graduate into more and more levels of discerning acceptance without losing ourselves or without losing the people who mean so much to us. And for all of us who know and love you, which is many people that I'm looking at right now, it means that the book, among other things, becomes a kind of floor routine where we watch the patron saint of the hyperbolic compliment, who loves nothing than to extend superlative praise, challenge herself to say something both enthusiastic and measured. And it's just exciting to see you take up the challenge. We should all issue ourselves personal challenges in our work, not just intellectual ones. And you not only did it, you fully fulfilled it.
There are going to be tears. Just warning.
Did you say gonna be? That's cute.
No, well, you know, just look closely. Should we do the chat? I mean, Alan?
Yes, well, we don't have any questions yet.
Oh,
I'm sure they're pending. But would anyone else like to take up the Julia's comments about idealization? Did Jocelyn or you or anyone else want to take it up?
I'll just say very quickly that what I think it demonstrates is something, you know, a bit similar to like what Nick is saying, but a way for us to think about our scholarship in general, which is both generous to ourselves and the process of idealization that I think we all do as we define a scholarly object, and then figuring out a way not to be ashamed of that, but to integrate it into a larger consideration of how we approach our objects of study. I think this is really like a model for how to do that responsibly, empathetically, kindly, and to start conversation. You know, there's too much scholarly work that shuts down conversation as opposed to starting it. And I think this is really a model. And that, I mean, that speaks to Julia as a person, obviously. You know, she is somebody who adores conversation, but she's somebody who's able to integrate that into her scholarly work too. And I just admire that so much. I really do.
Thanks, Jocelyn. We have a good question in the chat from Eliel Mamousset. While writing, was there a feeling that you were recreating your own younger self as an author? And did you ever find yourself wanting to shape that character more closely to the form of one of Bette Davis's characters?
wow. Eliel studied semiotics at Brown. So he writes mathematical code now, but he is a Brown semiotics major and a friend of many, many decades. So thank you for that great question. I think my first association is that I wanted to be a writer when I was a little girl, and was sure. And my beloved friend Ellie Herman, who's on the call, who had a long and flourishing career as a writer for television, though she never watched it and thought it was hilarious that I was always watching television as a graduate student. But anyway. She and I were partners in crime and thought we were going to be writers, and she actually became one. And so I think about all the films in which Davis is a writer. I'm thinking particularly of Old Acquaintance, and I feel like there are many others, but that's one that kind of comes to mind. And, you know, my experience of watching her I was never conscious enough. I had not been therapized by 8,000 years of therapy by that time, that what I was seeing was what I wanted to be. It was more almost like absorptive, that I had entered the television set in some way, that I was migrating almost bodily there. And as a teen, you know, depressed and withdrawn and melancholic, you know, there was nothing more wonderful than being absorbed and absorbing at the same time. So, you know, when I think about myself as the child who was watching, I think of myself in that room, which my brother and sister will really appreciate, had a blue shag carpet that was just hilarious, and beanbag chairs, and, you know, I mean, you could literally be absorbed. And my sister and brother came downstairs occasionally to watch with me, though, you know, it was a big lift, but they were wonderful, and they did. And I just think of that room almost falling away, except for the blue shag carpet and me and the television. And it's sort of like that incredible Jane Wyman film, you know, all this in all that heaven allows. No, All This in Heaven Too. And then the remake, right? The help me, Nick, the Todd Haynes remake. I mean,
You mean All That Heaven Allows and Far From Heaven?
yes, All That Heaven Allows and Far From Heaven. the obnoxious, supercilious children who buy Jane Wyman when she's widowed the television set to be her sort of, medication du jour, and she's not remotely interested. I don't think we ever see her turn it on, but you see her face reflected in the screen. And so it's like Jocelyn's, Joan Crawford, Bette Davis, Julia screens of Baby Jane viewing on television. That is sort of my screen memory for the whole experience of being a child in that basement and sort of wanting to be swept away. So that's what I see in my, in my mind's eye when I think about my childhood self watching. And it's like the atmosphere is all dissolved and it's just me and the television and the beanbag chair and the blue shag carpet.
Julia, here's a couple more questions. Maybe you can take these together. Jacob Wunsch asks for a recommendation on a gateway Bette Davis film. And Corey Cooper has a good question about the origins of the project. When did you determine your point of entry into this work? Did you always intend to acknowledge your younger self, or did that intention develop later?
I have to acknowledge both of those wonderful people. They were both honor students of mine at Northwestern. Jake wrote about Absalom. Corey wrote about being a Black feminist scholar reading Gone with the Wind. And they're now doing wonderful things in the world. Gateway, and I need help on this. Martin Schingler, help. I think now Voyager is a beautiful way to begin, and Dark Victory, sort of as a pair, and then I would go to Of Human Bondage, because we see in 1934 her sort of be willing to say fuck you to the viewer, and play this harridan who winds up deteriorating from venereal disease and dying. And All About Eve is delectable, 1950. It's another moment, another high moment. And then Baby Jane for sure. I think one cannot do wrong with all of those. So that's the sort of menu I would offer for Jake. And Corey, I had a lot of memoir in this at the beginning, and I got some really, really rough readers' reports on the early version of the manuscript, which Nick and Miriam sort of responded to with, paramedic energies. And it helped me, salvage what I thought was maybe dead and gone. And I had to cut a lot of, like my friend Ellie Herman, who I've mentioned 40 times today, she was in there in a long patch. Siblings were in there in a longer patch. And I sort of had to keep it. I had to keep what Miriam and Nick were so helpful with was saying, use the memoir to help the argument. Don't, just go off on 40 limbs, because, I would love to write a whole memoir about being a Jewish kid in Winnetka. At the time when we first moved there were covenants against Jewish homeowning. Friends, families experienced that. And I was one of two Jews in the third grade. The other was Dan Pritzker of the Hyatt Hotels and J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois family. And his affluence sort of made him not ethnic anymore. It sort of helped see, he assimilated in some way. And I was the other Jewish kid. And now the world is very different, but it was pretty stark. There was a quality of the 50s still living on in Winnetka in the 60s. Anyway, so my point of entry for myself was the racial dimension. The fact that I saw racial performance in Davis's films that struck me as a very little girl as crazy. I didn't know what I was seeing was minstrelsy, but it really bugged me. It did not comport with anything I knew about African Americans in several experiences I had had with African American families, or in this crazy moment where my mother took me to a Black Panther fundraiser when I was 14. We can have a moment of silence, just on how wild that is. Okay, I will now move on. But anyway, the people I had met who were African American did not sound and perform in this way at all. And it made me crazy. And so that's where the memoir seemed to be most powerful, was connecting with the political. Because otherwise, why is my voice special? A lot of people love old movies and could be talking about their devotion to the stars of classic Hollywood. But for me, it was the racial connection.
Thanks, Julia. Jane Schultz has an interesting question about a point you made earlier about absorption, the qualities of absorption watching these films. Did that get near to concepts of pleasure that are at some level difficult to represent in language?
Absolutely. And let me just add, my dear friends at that era all had boyfriends, and I did not. And I chose to, they were all extremely generous and welcoming, and I was, invited to hang out with everybody all, Fridays and Saturdays, etc. And I wanted to be with Bette Davis in the basement. And so, yes, pleasure was huge. I think it was pleasure that I didn't, it was beyond language. It was almost embodied and, identificatory. And, luckily, because, everything is rated, the Hays Code was so rigorous by the time of, most of her, even in Now Voyager, when she allegedly has a sleepover with Jerry in the Argentinian, cabin with the fires burning and then going out, right? I have wonderful arguments with my graduate students about, was there consummation? Was there not? I mean, it's a ridiculous question, but, in the novel there was. So I use that dirty trick. But in any case, yes, the pleasure was gigantic. It's like, how do you survive without pleasure, right? So that was mine. It was two-dimensional, but it was really great.
Julia, do you have any advice for, this is a question from Samantha English. Do you have any advice for scholars and students who so often work with figures they love, but often have to mask it or transform it?
There is, I think, a whole literature on author love that my beloved friend Helen Deutsch has made a career of, including with the University of Chicago Press. Loving Dr. Johnson is her wonderful book on her relationship with the great poet and dictionary maker. I think Helen and I have talked for years about these questions. I think the best thing one can do is absolutely interrogate, as Miriam put it, all the facets of that, in other words, to be super self-conscious about one's own cathexis, one's own attachments. And in the case of people like Jane Austen, there are a number of books. Claudia Johnson's wonderful third book is about tracing Jane Austen fans, right, across England and their pilgrimage rituals. Laurie Shannon's new work on Anne Lister, the great landowning, swashbuckling, diary writing polymath, lesbian polymath of Yorkshire, is going to, I imagine, Laurie, it's fair to say, you're going to be dealing with, the problems of idealization as well as, the complexity of her role and her self-conscious relation to her own diary writing. I think that is in a way our mandate as literary scholars at this late date, with higher education dying and the humanities in crisis, that we might as well do that full blast sort of analytical work. Jay Grossman's writing a biography on F.O. Matheson, the great Americanist critic, who created a field essentially, but had incredibly complex personal experiences and issues, and a queer relationship, and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think we can do this work anymore without the turning the facets of the jewel dynamic. So Samantha, I think we will talk about all of that.
Can I give Samantha one other word about that? Because I think it's such a good question. And I think that what can be very hard about it is figuring out how to get out of the loop of love or the loop of hate. Either of those can be very strong reasons initially to write or to stay obsessed with something or to connect with a text. But in the words of the great philosophers, third world, now that we found love, what are we going to do with it, right? Like you can't just, it can't, the whole thing can't be, she's great, she's great, she's great, she's great, or they're terrible, they're terrible, they're terrible, they're terrible. My own work on Tyler Perry started out as hate writing, and then I thought, I would like to live a long life. Let us not just do spite work. Let's do something that is a little bit more complicated. So I think the question becomes, what are you going to do with it? And I think this work is a great example of figuring out how to do something more with it. It's not about necessarily hiding it or pretending that that's not the root, but it's about growing it and figuring out, you know, what to do next.
It might also be that as we, you know, take lessons from our work and our life and take lessons from our life and our work, that there's maybe no love relationship that survives in our lives if you just keep hoping that nobody changes in it, you know, and that exploring its resilience and its change over time is probably the best way you can keep the love relationship going, rather than trick yourself into thinking that it's going to cost it something. And I just read Mark Harris's like brilliant biography of Mike Nichols, and all of his actors said the best thing he always did was he constantly asked us, I know about the script, but what is this in life? And I keep asking that in my own scholarship. And my answer to that in this case would be, let it change and turn into something that's still the same, but also different, like we do with all of our other loves.
I think we should mention another resource on this subject is Deirdre Lynch's Loving Literature, a Cultural History, which is quite relevant. Maybe we could wind up with one last question. There's one here from Michael Moranzi, and you can take this up, Julia, and maybe have the last word. Michael asks how you felt about entering a whole new field of film studies after having worked in early American literature. How do you see the book fitting with your earlier work? And was it empowering to begin as an amateur with a personal investment rather than as a professional expert, quote unquote?
That's a wonderful question, Michael, and I'm thrilled that you're here. And Michael is someone who started in early American history and went into legal and higher educational scholarship. So,
and there's one correction there, Julia. That question comes from Helen.
Oh,
but Michael is listening.
But Michael's listening. I'm thrilled. Okay, there's my brother and sister-in-law. Oh my God, I'm sorry. From Vienna. Can we just have a moment of silence? I think that I was extremely daunted to think I could enter this world. And in the first set of reviews I got, scholars who were my readers basically said, this is not the right bibliography. You need to read X, Y, Z, and Q. And it was like, you know, the Talmud, the recommendations that I got, which was great. And I was sort of mortified, and then went back and started reading them. And so I have always felt myself a kind of interloper in film scholarship because I wasn't trained. I was trained by Nick and Jocelyn and Miriam, basically. And Jim toward the end. So I think that what was wonderful, my second reader, who turned out to be Professor Jane Gaines of Columbia, you know, who's a revered feminist film scholar of melodrama, she kept giving me these great suggestions for thinking about stereotype versus typage, and for using the Birmingham School to think about, you know, modes of production, the industrial setup of film studios, and, you know, just, but there were maybe 40 of these recommendations, and it, you know, it took a long time to chase this all down. And so I think I never felt, I don't feel like I'm I feel like I'm a scholar of classical Hollywood Bette Davis. I can say that I've become a professional in that regard. I still see myself as an amateur. Jim and I are hoping to teach a course on classical Hollywood genres next year together. And that will be another way to indulge this. I would like to give everything up and just teach classical Hollywood at this point, but you know, it's not clear that the English department really gives a hoot about my doing that. So in any case, I think that the fact that it was a book that had memoir and also sort of racial history in it helped me deal with not being a film scholar because, you know, I've always been interested in cultural, you know, racial and cultural issues from the beginning. So I could draw on some of, you know, that's where Jocelyn's Hegel comes in. You know, I'm obsessed with the master-slave dialectic and use it wherever I can in any context, whether relevant or not. And so, you know, I would just like to say I am not a film scholar. I just play one on TV, but I can feel comfortable in saying that I've become a Bette Davis scholar.
Thanks so much, Julia.
Thank you all. So again, thank you for creating a memorial service to remember.
Well, I want to finish by mentioning that we have a number of other events coming up in the Buy the Book series. I'll put a link in the chat to anyone who wants to check out our schedule. But also, this has been just such a wonderful event. Julia, thank you for all these fantastic comments. Thanks to Jim and Nick and Jocelyn and Miriam for your responses to the book, and to all the rest of you for showing up. For those of you who don't yet own a copy of the book, please pick one up at the Seminary Co-op. The link again is in the chat. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.